was born with a small, honest face and an appetite for quiet. People always misread quiet, confusing it for weakness, for emptiness, for an invitation. Mark never misread it. He read me like a market novel he could skim. Cover, title, the obvious lines. That was his first mistake. My name is Anne. This is about how I stopped being a woman who forgave and became the architect of a justice he would never forget. We met in late spring, in a coffee shop that smelled of lemon oil and burnt sugar. He came in like every other man in every other small novel, an easy smile, a watch that shone just enough, and a laugh that knew when to stop. Mark was patient, charming in a way that suggested he had practiced it in front of mirrors. He liked my silence. It made him louder, grander. He called me calm, like it was an outfit I'd chosen to wear for him. He bought me a plant on our third date, a monstera with a single defiant leaf. For you, he said. To remind you to grow. We moved in together 3 months later. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a brick building with an elevator that blinked like an eye. He had a job in marketing, words and colors and strategy. He was good at promises. Even his apologies were well-laid plans. When our first fight came, I remember thinking that even our anger was aesthetic, measured, almost pleasing. The infidelity began like a whisper and ended like a recorded confession. I found the first clue in a snapshot on his phone. A woman leaning into him at a rooftop bar, her arm across his shoulder like a seam. At first I told myself it was nothing. A previous week, a drunken evening. I told myself the only thing that mattered was the way he looked at me when he came home. Bright-eyed, contrite, elaborate with affection. Forgiveness is a muscle. I flexed it as if I were training for a different life. And that was when my other mistake began. Believing that loving him required that I be small. It would have been easy to explode then. To call him a coward, to tear his photographs, to scream, to leave. That's what people write in books. Instantaneous clean exits, dramatic slammed doors. But I am not that kind of person. My temperament is an accumulation of small things that variable over time becomes a force. Instead of shouting, I listened. Instead of packing, I watched. Instead of confronting him, I catalogued. How do you read a life? You read its patterns. Mark had a signature, a way he softened his voice before lying, a ringtone for calls he did not want me to answer, a lock of hair that never obeyed his comb. In these details I found a map. It took me 3 months to understand the map. And it took me nearly a year to make it. At first, the revenge was not about retribution. It was an experiment. If a man thinks he can calibrate intimacy, he will keep doing it. He thinks the repair is mechanical. I set out to prove that a system can be subverted. I learned his calendar. Meetings labeled with client names, lunches with R. I sat across from him at his kitchen table, my hands folded, as he explained this or that. I feigned ignorance where necessary, and I cultivated trust where it would be useful. The trust to access his email, his social media, the trust to be allowed into his head. There is a strange power in being underestimated. Mark assumed I was harmless. His friends did too. People who are easy to betray tend to be easy to forget. That was their second mistake. I built a new life inside the life he thought he owned. I reintroduced myself as the same and externally but rearranged everything internally. I learned to speak his language. Numbers, schedules, the idioms of excuses. I used his tools against him. His loyalty to image, his fear of consequence, and his appetite for applause. The first phase of my plan was surgical. Collect the truth. I need proof, not suspicion. Suspicion collapses into paranoia. Proof is a weapon. So I started small. Screenshots, bank statements, messages. He was careful, but nobody is careful enough when their ego inflates like a balloon. He left traces. A hotel receipt hidden in a coat pocket. A credit card charge in the name of a boutique. A photo of lipstick on his collar that he thought was invisible to me because it was not where I would think to look. I documented everything like a scientist. Names, times, locations, gestures. I archived conversations verbatim. My notebook became a ledger of betrayal. Each page tightened something in me that I didn't recognize. Discipline, a hunger for structure. My notebooks looked like final exams. Neat dates, symbols, cross-references. With evidence in hand, the second phase was to remove his illusions publicly. Mark had a public persona. He curated it. Smiling at fundraisers, generous at board dinners, insistent about his moral center. He believed that reputation could absolve action. I intended to show him the equations that connect reputation to accountability. To begin, I needed leverage where it would hurt. The man who had hurt me loved being admired by his colleagues. He was proud of a promotion he'd hoped for, the kind that would have sealed him into the upper echelons of his firm. The promotion required a clean record, impeccable references, an image of fidelity, both moral and social. I cultivated his trust until it was near absolute. I volunteered at his office charity event, supporting him, I told myself then with perfect innocence. When they needed help with guest lists and thank you notes, I signed up. I learned where people held onto reputations and how they policed them. I watched his colleagues, noted their secrets, their vulnerabilities. I understood the architecture of their social status, and I found the easiest archway to collapse it. Before I explain further, let me make one thing clear. I did not set out to ruin lives gratuitously. Revenge is not about spectacle for its own sake. It is a correction. I wanted Mark to experience the consequence of his choices. If that required collapsing the scaffold he had built, so be it. I began with the simplest strike. Visibility. If the affair was hidden, I would make it visible. The woman, whose name was Laura, had become accustomed to being secondary in the dark. She shopped at the same boutique Mark had charged. She wore the same perfume that left a ghosty trace in elevators. Laura was not cruel. She was simply another casualty of Mark's appetite. She would not be the target of public humiliation. She would be the instrument of truth. I approached Laura through pretense and sympathy. I reached out to her one rainy afternoon under the pretext of a shared acquaintance. The conversation was awkward at first. She was in love with the persona Mark offered. The man who could promise a cloud of attention and never be there to rain on it. She told me without malice, the small details that corroborated what I already had. Meetings, shorthand messages, inside jokes he used in texts. I played the part of a woman who wanted closure. She wanted it too. The beauty of Laura's willingness was that it allowed me to avoid becoming the villain in a simpler story where a scorned woman stalks her rival. We aligned. She wanted to be acknowledged. I wanted to be avenged. We agreed on something quiet. A meeting, an exchange of undeniable proof, and the date when we would make it visible. Visibility meant exposure. Exposure in modern life means digital evidence. I collected everything, packaged it with care. Photos, receipts, timestamps. I created an account, anonymous, airtight, and sent them a dossier. For you, it said in the subject line, so you know. The effect was instantaneous, devastating in a way that felt almost clinical. Mark's calm fractured. He entered the first stage of panic. Denial laced with anger. I recorded his calls. I saved his texts where he threatened that if I did anything, he'd ruin me. He didn't know how to read the ledger I had become. He thought of me as the kind of woman who, when hurt, sobbed and left. He never made room for the possibility that I would study him, learn him, and construct fate around his tendencies. There was a pivotal night. The gala. Mark had been nominated for that promotion. The room smelled of perfume and money. He walked through it like a king. I sat at a corner table, a drink folded into my hand, an image of composure painted across my face. Laura arrived, pale and shaking, and sat at my table. She had that quiet, steady look of someone who had decided to be brave. When the moment came, we did not create drama. We delivered evidence. I hired, through means that seemed innocuous, a private investigator. A woman I had found through an online forum for investigative professionals. She was sharp, efficient, and she knew how to present data without drama. The investigator collated what I had gathered and produced a file, professional and undeniable. We handed it to the head of the hiring committee, an older man with a reputation for integrity. He studied the documents, then looked at Mark, who had come to the table for moral support. That look, when the committee head shifted his gaze from the paper to the man, was the beginning of Mark's unraveling. I did not shout. I did not create a scene. I sat and watched Mark try to explain himself in language suited to television confessional. It was pathetic. When the committee agreed his behavior would be reviewed, the first small sliver of my satisfaction arrived like a pinprick. It was enough to make me steady. But revenge rarely follows a straight line. Mark fought. He hired counsel, he begged. He painted me as the manipulative woman who wanted to sabotage him. He brought witnesses, people who had known of his charms and forgiven him. He became an example of how an individual can mobilize a social network to erase inconvenient facts. At this point I could have stopped. He had lost the promotion, his image was tarnished, and he was exposed. But exposure was not enough. He had to feel the demolition that matched his betrayal. And so I escalated, not with violence, but with psychological architecture. There is an art to making someone confront the narrative they created about themselves. Mark had always believed he was generous and in control. I intended for him to feel the exact opposite. To achieve that, I targeted the scaffolding he relied upon. His social currency, his bank of trust, the stories others told about him. I began to leak small, precise releases of information. Anonymous emails to his clients about questionable expense reports. Quiet messages to his brother about the woman he'd been seeing. A blog post that described a case study in emotional manipulation, written as a composite of actors that were obviously Mark if one knew his life. People started whispering. In those whispers, Mark saw the world he had curated crumble. He retaliated with the crude force of someone who had never needed consequence. He lashed out at me in public. He tried to blackmail me with slander. He went to our friends and painted me as unhinged. He drank and posted photos of himself outside nightclubs with a laugh that sounded like a chain dragged across a floor. He sent messages at 2 a.m., too many and too slurred. He begged for reconciliation in the most performative ways possible. Flowers on the table, notes left in books. Each note was an attempt to buy time, but time had become my instrument. The transformation in me, at the heart of all of this, was not cruelty. It was precision born of righteous anger. I had been wronged, yes, but I had also been underestimated. I learned a new language. Deadlines, press releases, legal letters. I learned to lean into discomfort and stay there. People often believe revenge is about breaking the other person. In many ways, it's about breaking the pattern that allowed the harm. He needed to understand that his actions had consequences beyond privacy invasion and broken hearts. He had to learn that others would judge not just his desire but his responsibility. Then came the night that felt like the endgame. We were no longer in love, but we lived under the same roof because leaving would have meant admitting defeat. We argued less often, but our silences grew loud. I moved in the apartment like a surgeon in a familiar space. I knew where everything was. Mark had begun to drink more openly. It made him slovenly, which made him careless. His greatest vulnerability. On a Tuesday, he came home with the kind of voice that always publicized triumph. A promotion had been reinstated, or so he claimed after a review. He wanted to celebrate. I listened and smiled. A small part of me wanted him to believe he had one more victory. It was a test. And as he poured wine, he mentioned a name in a casual way, the way people use names as anchors to reality. Rachel, he said, has already started the orientation packet. This was a small thing, but the memory lodged itself. That night I left a single printed page on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to him. No drama. No flourish. Just a single page with a line that cut through the veneer. You once told me fidelity is not about bodies but about promises. You broke them. Now face the consequence. He read it, laughed, and crumpled it. But then, as if a switch had been turned, he looked toward the door as if expecting something, or someone. For the rest of the night he was jittery, alternating between bravado and suspicion. I had expected that. People often fall apart in the space carved by doubt. The next morning his phone buzzed with a message that would unmake him. It was a video, short, deliberately edited. It began with Mark in his office at a holiday party, glass in hand, laughing. The camera angle shifted and then focused on a woman, Rachel, who was rubbing his leg under the table while an executive told a joke. The footage was intimate without being pornographic. It was precisely the kind of visual evidence that would cause a professional to be called into HR and a social man to be called into shame. The video was sent, anonymously, to everyone in his firm, then to a few close friends, and then, with surgical timing, to a journalist I had met months earlier, someone who specialized in corporate ethics columns. The journalist, a woman with a kind of appetite for human drama that made her excellent at her job, called. She asked for confirmation. I gave none. She published a piece that did not single me out but exposed the pattern of behavior that Mark had hoped would remain private. He came home the same day and did not speak for a long time. His eyes were small. It was the look of someone who could not style a face to disguise the terror of revelation. He tried to find me, to blame me, to deny responsibility, but there was nowhere to hide. The firm suspended him pending investigation. Clients requested meetings. His friends, most of them, drifted. I did not feel victorious yet. The taste of his downfall was thin. I wanted more than his humiliation. I wanted transformation. I wanted the man who had loved effortlessly to learn the cost of loving like that. Legal matters began to unfold. Mark threatened lawsuits. He accused me of harassment, of violating privacy. I let him swallow that claim. He had begun to speak loudly without facts. When he filed, he added details, a claim that I had trespassed, that I had spied on him. He thought he could weaponize the courts to reclaim his image. He didn't reckon with the evidence in my ledger. I forwarded copies of his texts, his receipts, the deposits he had made for hotel rooms, to counsel. The investigator's sworn affidavit described the dates and times and the people. I had been careful. I had not broken laws. I had used legal tools, publicly available records, voluntary testimonies. The law is a language. I learned to speak it. At the deposition, Mark floundered. His testimony contradicted earlier statements. He had not expected me to be organized. When the judge asked a question about motive, Mark tried to claim entrapment, the oldest defense of the privileged. It was weak. He was implausible. The judge, I sensed, quietly disapproved. During the court proceedings, something remarkable happened. Mark's friends, people who had once sat at our dinner table, began to reach out to me. Not to apologize, this was not about apologies, but to offer facts. We didn't know, one said. We only saw what he wanted us to see. Another brought photos from company retreats that showed patterns of behavior. The narrative of Mark as a saint ruptured like old wallpaper. People often take the easier story, denial, because it cushions them. But when more than one person tells you the same thing, it becomes a different kind of truth. The media picked up the case. Headlines do not tell the whole story, but they do alter reality. Mark became the executive accused of serial misconduct. He called it a smear campaign. But a smear requires fabrication. Ours was built on corroborated facts. The firm settled quietly, asking Mark to resign with dignity. He lost his salary, his office, the things he had used to measure himself. And yet, having stripped him of social currency, I still felt the ache. Vengeance can be empty if it simply mimics the violence you endured. So I changed my aim. The last phase had to be about me, about reclaiming myself from the person I had been. Quiet, forgiving, small. I moved. I told him I was staying to work through things, but I did not. I left a week later, taking nothing but a suitcase and the Monstera plant he'd given me, its single leaf still defiant. I rented a smaller apartment across town. I painted the walls white. White is not emptiness. It is a field where new things can grow. I began to write at night, lines that traced the memory of what had happened and the person I had become. It was not therapy. It was history-making. I met my own edges in the silence of a studio apartment. I learned to be fierce for myself without the need for someone to betray me to discover it. I enrolled in a course about digital privacy because the tools that had unmade Mark were ones I believed everyone should know. I taught classes to women about online safety and boundaries. I started a small podcast where I interviewed people who had been hurt in quiet ways. The project was not titled Revenge. It was called After Quiet. It became small and meaningful. People wrote to me, quietly, and told me their stories. Some thanked me. Some asked how I had found the nerve to act. I told them the truth. You begin by cataloging. Years later, in a way that was both expected and anticlimactic, Mark contacted me. His voice on the phone was a patchwork of regret and bitterness. He had a new job, a life that looked smaller than the one he had once flaunted. And, he said, I want to meet. I want to apologize. Apologies are curious things. They can be tools too, tokens that restore balance when the cost is just. I listened to him, and somewhere between the syllables I recognized not contrition but an attempt to clarify his narrative. He wanted redemption in the eyes of the person he had hurt most. I met him once, in a cafe with a window that showed the street like a movie. He had aged differently than I expected. Less sheen, more lines. He wanted to tell me he was sorry. He wanted absolution. I let him say it and then told him what I had learned. People like you, I said quietly, build identities out of permissions. You ask permission to be admired and then assume it will always be given. My revenge was simple. I stopped giving you permission. He looked at me then, really looked, perhaps for the first time. Not with the practiced softness he had always used, but with the sharpness of someone attempting to map a person he thought he knew. He asked if I had hated him. No, I said. I felt betrayed. Hate is too simple. It implies only a single emotion. What I felt was an accumulation. A demand to be recognized. Revenge was a way to demand recognition when it was denied. He left the cafe with a small, hesitant nod. I understood then that winning does not always look like someone's ruin. Sometimes victory is a new life that renders the old betrayer irrelevant. I still have the monstera. It sits on my windowsill, leaves unfurling in a patient green. I have learned to speak boundaries plainly, to cultivate them like plants. I am not smaller for the revenge I orchestrated. I am larger. The ledger of betrayal that once felt like a weight now reads like instruction. Know, prepare, act. Some people will condemn me. They will say I became the thing I hated, that I weaponized pain. Maybe they are right in part. I am not innocent. I was hurt and I hurt back. But I did not destroy without reason. I exposed a pattern that would have continued. I reclaimed myself by dismantling the structure that held him aloft. Mark is a figure in my past now. Sometimes I dream of him in neutral colors. Gray suits, always smiling with a little too much effort. Sometimes I dream of Laura and thank her silently for helping me see what I needed to see. Sometimes I dream of the committee head who looked at me with a type of rough respect. I think dreams are the mind's way of cleaning up. People ask if I felt better when the world saw him for what he was. I feel better in ways I did not expect. I feel lighter, not because I toppled him, but because in doing so I toppled the old version of myself who thought forgiveness was the only way to keep love. I learned that love can ask for respect. I learned that self-preservation is not petty. And sometimes, when I am alone with a plant and a book in the hush of evening, I write down the names of the things I will no longer tolerate. I write them as a ritual. I set rules for what I will accept in my life. The rules are not cruel. They are simply boundaries. I have discovered that revenge, properly carried out, is less about spectacle than about the quiet establishment of limits. If you are listening to this story because you too have been underestimated, take this. Build your ledger. Collect your truths. Strength is often quieter than we imagine. It grows in the careful cataloging of small things, in the patience to wait for clarity, in the discipline to act without collaterals that you will regret. Revenge is not always necessary. But when it is, let it be precise, let it be proportionate, and let it end with you standing in a field of white where you can start again. I was wronged, I collected proof, I acted. And in the aftermath, I won the most important thing. The right to grow, uninterrupted.